He never asked much of her. She came in early, left late, always quiet, always respectful. The type of person who made herself so invisible, most forgot she was even there. But not Jonathan. Not this time. That morning, he noticed something different. The way she held the teacup. How her sleeve stayed pulled far down her wrist. And when she turned slightly, just enough for the light to hit her cheek, there it was. The bruise. Purple. Faint. But unmistakable. She saw him looking, and for a second their eyes met. That's when she lied. Just bumped into a cabinet, she said. But Jonathan had seen bruises like that before. They weren't from cabinets. And they didn't just happen. He set the cup down, heart heavy, mind racing. Something was wrong. Something wasn't being said. And from that moment on, he couldn't let it go. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Mary, really? To most, she was just the maid. The quiet woman who showed up when the rest of the world was still asleep. She moved through the mansion like she belonged to the shadows, never overstepping, never speaking unless spoken to. But Jonathan had seen the hesitation in her hands, the way she glanced over her shoulder even when the room was empty. He'd built his fortune on reading people, on spotting risks before anyone else did. And something about Mary, it didn't add up. What had happened in her life before she came to that mansion? What was she hiding behind those polite smiles and long sleeves? And the bigger question, why had no one asked before? Why had everyone accepted her silence as safety? Jonathan couldn't unsee the bruises, and once he started asking questions, what he uncovered inside his own home would leave everyone wondering just how long the truth had been hiding in plain sight. Jonathan Morgan wasn't born into wealth. He'd grown up in the foster system, passed from home to home until he learned to stop expecting comfort, let alone affection. At 19, he built his first online business from a public library computer. 10 years later, he was sitting on a tech empire that spanned 3 continents. Success came easy after a while, but trust never did. He kept people at a distance. Staff were hired through agencies. Meetings were scheduled down to the minute. No attachments, no distractions. And that's why Mary stood out. She didn't ask for favors. She didn't overstep. She just showed up, did her work, and disappeared before anyone noticed. For Jonathan, that was perfect. Mary Walker was a single mother with a past she didn't speak about. On her resume, she was a licensed nursing assistant with a 10-year employment gap. When the agency sent her over, Jonathan barely looked twice. She was quiet, polite, older than most of the staff he'd employed before. But she seemed grateful, too grateful. She apologized for things no one else would. She asked if she could mop a second time, even when the floors were already clean. There was something fragile in her tone, something that suggested she'd learned to walk on eggshells long before she ever stepped into Jonathan's house. At first, he didn't question it. People had their reasons. But over time, small things stood out. Mary started arriving later and later, sometimes looking like she hadn't slept. She'd jump if someone entered the room too quickly. Her eyes darted toward every sound. She never took off her sweater, not even in the hottest weeks of July. Jonathan wasn't one to pry, but he noticed. He always noticed. He told himself it was none of his business. But something about the way she kept her head down told him this wasn't just about stress, it was about fear. And then came that morning. The cup of tea. The bruise. The lie. It happened on a Thursday. Mary came in just after 7 a.m., same as usual. Jonathan was seated at the breakfast table, scrolling through emails on his tablet. She approached with a porcelain cup of Earl Grey, hands steady until they weren't. The tea spilled slightly over the rim. She winced. Not from the heat, but from something deeper, reflexive, involuntary. Jonathan looked up. Her sleeve had slipped just an inch, enough to reveal the purple shading on her wrist. His eyes rose to her face. There was a faint mark under her eye, fresh, covered with makeup, but not well. "What happened?" he asked, casually at first. Mary straightened too quickly. "Oh, I bumped into a cabinet," she said. Too rehearsed, too fast. Jonathan said nothing more, but something inside him wouldn't let it go. That night, long after the house was quiet, he pulled up the security footage from the side entrance. What he saw made his chest tighten. At 2:17 a.m., a dark-colored sedan pulled into the rear alley. Mary walked outside with a trash bag. She paused. A figure stepped out of the car, tall, aggressive male. The footage had no audio, but Jonathan could see the exchange. Her body language shifted. She backed away, then stood frozen. The man gestured with his hands, angry, rapid. Then she walked back inside. Her steps were stiff. Jonathan couldn't sleep that night. He told himself he was overthinking it, that maybe she just had a complicated family situation. But the next day, she was late. No message. No call. When she arrived, she apologized a dozen times in under a minute. Later that week, Jonathan left work early. He told his driver to stay back and waited across the street from the metro station where Mary normally boarded her bus. At 6:42 p.m., he saw her head down, moving fast. Then the sedan appeared again. Same model, same driver. The man didn't speak. He grabbed her arm. She resisted. He shoved her forward and forced her into the back seat. It was over in seconds. Jonathan rushed across the street, but the car was gone. That night he confronted her, asked her who the man was, what was happening. Mary broke. Quiet at first. Then the tears came. She told him his name was Calvin, that he wasn't supposed to know where she lived, that he had promised never to come near her again, that she didn't know how he found her. She begged Jonathan not to get involved. But for the first time in years, Jonathan couldn't turn away. He thought calling the cops was the right move. He had no idea what he was stepping into. Jonathan didn't hesitate. That same night, he called the police. He gave them everything: security footage, dates, even the license plate number he had memorized during the encounter outside the metro. The officers took his statement, but it was Mary they wanted to hear from. When they questioned her the next morning, she looked like someone being interrogated for a crime she hadn't committed. Hands shaking, voice low, apologizing after nearly every sentence. But she told them the truth, or most of it. Calvin Torres, her ex-partner, a man she'd left nearly 3 years ago. She'd moved cities, changed her name on some documents, started over. But somehow, Calvin had found her again. She said he'd been showing up for weeks, that he watched her from across the street. Sometimes he followed her, but she never told anyone, because the last time she involved the police, it made things worse. This time, she had hoped silence would protect her. The detectives started digging. Calvin Torres had a record: assault, domestic violence, one charge of false imprisonment that had been dismissed years earlier. He'd served time in county jail, and while there was no active restraining order, the pattern was clear. When the officers visited his listed address, he wasn't home. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him in over a week. The investigation intensified. Jonathan offered to put Mary and her son in a safe apartment under temporary surveillance. She refused at first, said she didn't want to cause trouble. Jonathan insisted. He wasn't doing it for charity. He was doing it because he knew fear when he saw it. And Mary wasn't just afraid, she was preparing for something. Days later, another call came in, this time from a neighbor in Mary's old building, where she'd lived before working for Jonathan. The neighbor had heard yelling through the walls, arguing something about a boy, followed by a loud crash. Child Protective Services responded. They found Mary's son, 9 years old, hiding in a closet. He was unharmed but shaken. The apartment had been tossed. Mary's name was still on the mailbox, but she hadn't lived there in over a year. Someone had broken in and used her name to access the unit. CPS flagged the case as high risk. At first, detectives thought Calvin had returned and was escalating, but then something didn't make sense. The man captured on the building's exterior camera didn't match Calvin's profile. He was shorter. He moved differently. The timestamps also conflicted. Calvin had an alibi that night logged on surveillance footage across town. Someone else was in that apartment, and whoever it was, they knew Mary's history, her connections, even her child's whereabouts. But Calvin wasn't working alone. The case took an unexpected turn when detectives retrieved additional footage from a private storage facility near Mary's old apartment. The security camera showed a woman entering the unit days before the break-in. She used a key. She knew the passcode, and her face was unmistakable: Clarissa Walker, Mary's older sister. Until that moment, Clarissa hadn't come up in any of the interviews. But according to records, the two hadn't spoken in over 2 years. When investigators tracked her down, she admitted to contacting Calvin, said she hadn't meant for things to go so far, said she thought he just needed closure. But under pressure, the truth came out. There had been money, inheritance from their late mother. A life insurance policy Mary had cashed out early to escape her situation. Clarissa thought she was owed part of it. She knew where Mary had moved, and she told Calvin, knowing full well what kind of man he was. But what troubled Jonathan even more was what Mary had kept from him. During her work at the mansion, she'd assisted with record-keeping for one of his private clients, a senator up for re-election. Nothing high-level, just personal calendars, email correspondence, phone messages. Still, it raised questions. What had Mary seen? Who might have noticed her proximity to someone that powerful? Jonathan began wondering whether the abuse was just part of it, or if Calvin had been sent not just as an ex but as a silencer. The theory was never proven, but the possibility was enough to make the investigation a priority. Together with law enforcement, Jonathan helped orchestrate a sting. They used Clarissa as bait, told her she'd be receiving a legal settlement if she appeared to sign a final set of papers. They knew she would contact Calvin. She did, and he came, this time armed. But officers were waiting nearby. Both were arrested on the spot. Calvin for attempted kidnapping, prior assault charges, and probation violations. Clarissa for conspiracy and obstruction. The mugshots made headlines. A press conference was called. But Mary didn't attend. She stayed home. The weight of everything that had come crashing down around her was too much. She'd survived, but barely. The system had caught up, but not in time to stop what had already been set in motion. Mary testified once. Briefly. Her voice cracked and she trembled through every word. But she told the court what Calvin had done, how he followed her, how Clarissa had betrayed her, how she'd lived in fear every single day she stepped outside her door. The courtroom was silent. Her son Joshua had been taken into foster care during the investigation, placed in a state-run home on the edge of the city. But once the charges were confirmed and her story checked out, she was allowed visitation, then custody. Slowly, painfully, the system began to return pieces of her life. Jonathan covered her legal fees without question. He found her an apartment in a secured building, paid for a counselor, even arranged for a part-time job at a local library. It wasn't charity. It was what he believed any decent man would do. And for a short while, it looked like Mary was going to have the second chance she never thought possible. But on the night she was officially released from court supervision, Mary vanished. There was no note, no call, no sign of struggle. Her phone was left behind, turned off, still plugged into the charger. The last confirmed sighting came from a grainy security camera outside a Greyhound bus station. She stood alone, wearing a dark coat and carrying one small duffel bag. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. She bought a one-way ticket. The destination? A small town 3 states away. A town with no known connection to her past. She didn't use her real name. She never contacted Jonathan, and no one has seen her since. To this day, she hasn't been found, and Jonathan never heard from her again. Did she run from gratitude? From memories too painful to relive? Or from something else, something no one ever discovered? Some people survive the storm. Others become it. Would you have seen the signs? What would you have done if you were in Jonathan's position? Would you have stepped in the moment you saw the bruise? Would you have pushed further, even when she lied? Or would you have looked away, like so many others did, convincing yourself it wasn't your place? Jonathan Morgan didn't know what he was walking into. He only knew something was wrong. And when the truth finally came out, it was more than he could have ever imagined. A woman hiding from violence, a sister driven by greed, a man who would do anything to keep her silent, and a second chance that vanished without explanation. And if you thought this story was chilling, wait until you hear about the nurse who vanished after one final shift. One hallway security camera, one message left behind, and one mystery no one has been able to solve. Subscribe for more true life mysteries and dark twists that make you question everything.